All right, so here's my weekly reminder to remember to RSVP and go on DACDB for anything that you may want to attend so that we know you're coming, so that we can make all the preparations we need to make sure that everyone is well taken care of. And hey Patty, is Emery Ware on Zoom for us today? No. Okay, well, we'll postpone the Rotaract update. And I want to thank everyone who contributed to the UCOM Holiday Project Drive chaired by President-elect Richard. Everyone was so generous in cash donations, especially during this time of year. And I want to tell you that today's the last day. If you'd still like to get in on that, it's too late for food. But if you want to make a donation,
I haven't checked.
Then we're happy to accept that today as well. And I want to remind you next week for our holiday luncheon, I want everyone to bring toys, unwrapped toys to benefit Daniel Kids. We'll deliver the toys that afternoon. And gift cards are great too for Amazon, Walmart, Target, wrapping paper, gift bags, bows, those are needed as well. So if you're not able to be here next week, then you can let Patty know and fill your account so we can do that in lieu of your presence, literally and metaphorically. So, so let Patty know if we can help you out with that as well. So, hey Patty, is Tyree Boyer on Zoom? No. So, so we're going to put somebody on the spot. It's going to be President-elect Richard. Yeah. Come on up. We're going to introduce visitors and guests. Richard.
All right. Do you have any clues? No.
No.
All right. Has anyone?
I just want to hear you sing.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. Everybody needs a prompt. It's all good.
That's really funny. Okay. Any guests of Rotarians this afternoon? How about visitors?
No.
How about fun?
Okay. Go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go.
Do it. Go.
Welcome you today. So glad you came along, glad you came our way. And the fellowship is yours in sunshine or in rain. We here in Rotary say welcome, come again. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, you never know whether you're going to be coming up here or not, you know. Right. Okay. So we're moving on to our program, and today we have our own Ed Booth. Skip to us, a board-certified aviation law attorney and member of the Florida Bar for 39 years, a member of our club for 33 years. More big numbers. Skip received his undergrad degree from the Emory University and law degree from Florida State. He is best known for his aviation law practice that includes crash litigation, representation of clients before the FAA and NTSB, and serving as counsel to aircraft owners and operators. He was the first attorney in Florida to become board certified in aviation law by the Florida Bar. As an experienced pilot for over 43 years, Skip holds a multi-engine air transport license and has logged nearly 4,000 hours of flight experience. Please join me in welcoming our own Skip Booth.
Good afternoon. Patty, can you just wave if the audio is working okay? I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Thank you for having me today to talk about my favorite subject, aviation. I'm going to start with some late-breaking aviation news. Probably the most famous living aviator in the United States passed away yesterday, General Chuck Yeager, 97 years old. It was highly improbable he would make it to the age of 25, much less 97. He flew combat in World War II, broke the sound barrier, undertook all sorts of dangerous missions, was denied a rightful place in the early space program. There was a requirement for the early astronauts to have college degrees, and he did not have one, but for that requirement, I believe he might have been the first person to land on the moon. In my aviation art collection, I have a Chuck Yeager print that's to my left that shows his World War II mount, a P-51 Mustang. Shot down 15 enemy planes in 8 missions before he was shot down and captured, and spent the rest of the war as a POW, although he did escape once. And this is one of my favorite pieces, and it is autographed by General Yeager. So it's an interesting passing, certainly an accomplished aviator and a wonderful life. Today we're going to talk about an aviator you've probably never heard of, Bessie Coleman, who has a Jacksonville connection and a fascinating life story that almost 100 years after her death continues to inspire people to overcome obstacles and do things that people tell them that they can't do. And so I am going to put my presentation up. Okay, Patty, is that visible now? Okay. I call the presentation Bessie Coleman's Journey to Jacksonville. It's the culmination of about 30 years of on and off research I had done into her life and her final days here in Jacksonville. And I have to move fast because there's a lot to cover. But I think you're going to learn some things that you didn't know about before. Coleman is commonly referred to as Queen Bess. She was born in 1892, died at the age of 34 here in Jacksonville in May of 1926. I have been flying for a long, long time. I have owned this particular airplane for 33 years now, have about 3,000 hours in it, flying all around the United States, Canada, and the Bahamas. The airplane has a rotary connection in that I purchased it in 1988 from our longtime honorary member, Admiral Byron Fuller. Admiral Fuller was a POW in Vietnam, spent 7.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. When he was released from captivity, he stayed in the Navy, rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. His last Navy airplane was an F-14 Tomcat. When he joined civilian life, he bought this airplane, which he told me that after about 5 years, he wanted to fly upside down again, and sold this to me and bought an aerobatic airplane. But I keep it out of Jackson International and fly it as often as I can. Today, we're going to talk about Bessie Coleman, the first African-American aviator to hold a pilot certificate from a credentialed institution. We're going to start by talking about her early years, how she learned to fly, the obstacles she overcame, and then her final days here in Jacksonville, Florida. She was born in 1892 in Atlanta, Texas, one of 13 children. She has an interesting background in that her father was half African American and half Cherokee Indian. Her mother was African American. So she holds claim to being the first African American credentialed pilot, as well as the first Native American credentialed pilot. And until recently, few people have heard of her. She worked with her family farming. They were sharecroppers. When she was 2 years old, they moved to Waxahachie, Texas. And just a brief geography lesson, this gives you an idea of where Atlanta, Waxahachie are in relation to Dallas, Texas. There's a historical marker on the land where the Coleman family lived in Waxahachie that tells her life story. And in the past 10 to 20 years, historical markers commemorating various aspects of her life have sprung up all around the United States, and Jacksonville is noticeably absent from this, and we'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. In 1915, in her early 20s, she moved with some of her brothers to Chicago, Illinois. She worked as a beautician. She later ran a chili parlor in Chicago. Both of these locations have plaques commemorating her time there. 1917, 1919, in that time period, her brothers returned from fighting World War I and told her tales of women flying airplanes. And this is something that in 1919 was simply not possible in the United States, and her race presented an immovable barrier to her flying airplanes, but she wasn't deterred. And that is the first fascinating part of her story, is how she learned to fly. She could have done a number of things. She excelled at most things she did, but she wanted to be an aviator, to have a career in aviation. She was told in no uncertain terms, there's no way you can do this. She was particularly good at networking. She cultivated groups of very influential people, one of whom was Robert Abbott, who was at the time probably the most prominent African American in the town of Chicago. He was the publisher of a well-known newspaper known as the Chicago Defender. And Bessie became friends with him, shared her goals and aspirations with him, and he encouraged her and most likely paid for her to go to France to learn how to fly, because nobody in the United States in 1919 was going to teach an African-American woman how to fly an airplane. So in 1920, Bessie boards this particular ship and sails for France. She arrives in France on November the 20th of 1920, and due to the connections with Mr. Abbott and funds he's provided, enrolls in, at the time, what was the most prestigious flying school in the world. If you had a license from this school, it really meant something. There were African American men flying in different parts of the world at this time. No African American women, but none of them had official pilot certificates from a credentialed school. To the left is a picture of Bessie Coleman's US passport. So she arrives in France, enrolls in a flight school. She learns to fly in World War I surplus airplanes, specifically a very difficult to fly contraption called a Newport Type 82. You know, the lifespan of a World War I combat pilot in France was measured in days, if not weeks. They were very unforgiving machines. And here's a picture of Bessie with one of the Newport biplanes she learned to fly in. About 8 months later, she is awarded a highly coveted pilot certificate from the premier credentialing institution that happens to be in France, and flies around Europe, puts on some demonstrations, and returns to the United States in mid-1922 and embarks on a career as a stunt pilot, as a trick pilot is the term they used back then. And in September of 1922, she flew her first air show in Long Island, New York. In addition to flying, Bessie Coleman was a prolific lecturer. One of the things she did in every city she visited was go to schools, typically historically Black schools, high schools, elementary schools, and gave lectures about her life, about the obstacles she had overcome. She showed film of her flying in France, and her lectures contributed to her fame as much as her flying did. As was typical with some of the more flamboyant aviators in the 20s, you had to have a flashy outfit, and she had a military style uniform that she wore, was considered very fashionable. We're fortunate to have around 100 photographs of Bessie. There are a number of artists have attempted renditions of her. The one on the right hangs in the San Diego Aerospace Museum. As she comes back to the United States, she is typically flying an aircraft known as a Curtiss Jenny. This is a photo on the left of this slide showing Bessie standing on the wheel of a Curtiss Jenny. They were very unforgiving airplanes, and she crashed in February of 1923 while performing at an air show in Santa Monica, California. And for a time, it was thought her flying days were over due to the magnitude of her injuries. But she recovers and resumes lecturing and performing around the United States. One of the problems she faced is she didn't really have an airplane. She didn't have the money to buy an airplane and was constantly handicapped with that. But in 1925, 2 or 3 years after learning how to fly, she returns to her home state of Texas as a famous aviator, particularly within the African American community. She spends Christmas of 1925 in her hometown of Chicago, pondering her next move. And in January of 1926, 6 months before she arrives in Jacksonville, she heads for the South to give lectures because she didn't have an airplane at this particular time. So she lectures in Atlanta, Savannah, and Augusta. And then we get to her Jacksonville connection or her Florida connection. In February of 26, she appears in Tampa and West Palm Beach, typically at movie theaters, where films of her flying are shown, and then she gives a lecture. In February of 1926, she writes to Richard Norman. Norman's another person with a deep connection to Jacksonville you may never have heard of. Norman ran a silent film studio in the Arlington section of Jacksonville that produced African-American films with African-American actors and actresses. And this was during the silent film era. And believe it or not, Norman Studios is still there and has recently been restored. But Norman was the go-to person if you were African American and wanted a movie made. And she asked Norman to consider making a film of her life. And this is Norman pictured on the left. We're fortunate to have the correspondence between Bessie Coleman and Norman. And she first tells him that she's a famous person, that she believes a movie about her life would be very interesting, and that a major movie could be made. Norman writes her back 5 days later and says he's interested. Bessie had come up with a title, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. She predicted that it could be a 5 or 6 reel movie, which is a long film. 6 reels in a silent movie worked out to about a 2-hour show. And she thought she had enough material for that. But remember the 5 or 6 reel proposal. But Norman writes back and says, this is all well and good, but who is going to pay for this? Norman was enthusiastic, but did not appear to have the money. Bessie writes him back 2 weeks later, first apologizing that she had moved from Tampa to West Palm Beach and the letter wasn't forwarded promptly, and again pitches the fact that her life is interesting and she believes she could direct and star in the movie. We have the original correspondence from the files of Mr. Norman, and this is Bessie's own handwriting. Bessie is killed here in Jacksonville, Florida in May of 26 before the movie idea is analyzed further. However, Norman produces a film a couple of years later called The Flying Ace, which historians unanimously agree is inspired by the life of Bessie Coleman, even though Norman doesn't really give her credit for the movie. Nonetheless, The Flying Ace features the type of airplane Bessie Coleman flew and appears to have been based on some of her exploits, particularly on the airshow circuit. Was filmed here in Arlington at Norman Studios, and it is the only film from Norman's body of work in the silent film era that has survived. You can go on YouTube and watch the 2-hour-long Flying Ace movie. The movies of the era were filmed on a very flammable acetate film base, and very few films from that era have survived. Norman Studios has survived. The picture on the left, and this is on Arlington Road between Arlington and Lone Star, has recently been restored to its former glory. The building on the right is representative of the restoration that's been done. This particular building was featured in many of Norman's movies and shows up in the Flying Ace as the canteen where the pilots hung out. Before it was restored, it was a dance school run by Lori Norman, and our own Patty Chapman tells me she was a student at this dance school some time ago. And this is the original sign from the dance school as it appeared about 15 years ago. And it has been restored by an organization. It's thought to be the only silent film studio that one can visit. It's still a work in progress, and we really haven't exploited its full potential. Bessie Coleman winds up in Orlando, Florida in 1926. She's very religious and has formed a friendship with a pastor and his wife at the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, which is still there today. It's only a couple of blocks from the Amway Center in downtown Orlando. She opens a beauty parlor in Orlando to raise money to buy an airplane. She lectures at schools in the Orlando area, true to her form. And she, again, I told you she was an expert at networking. We'll never know if some sort of romance may have been involved in this, but she forms a friendship. The history books call it a friendship, a relationship, with an Edwin Beeman, who was the heir to a chewing gum fortune. A man with a lot of money, spent his winters in the Orlando area, and Bessie becomes friends with him, and he agrees to put up the money to buy an airplane. She finds a Curtiss Jenny, same type of airplane she crashed in California in 1923. She found a used one in Dallas, Texas, purchased it sight unseen, and arranged for a pilot to fly it to Jacksonville, Florida, where she was scheduled to perform in an air show on May the 1st of 1926. As I've said, the Curtiss Jenny is a very unforgiving airplane. It killed many, many pilots. And if you don't believe me, let's talk about this example. Aviation enthusiasts over the past 80 or 90 years have attempted to restore Curtiss Jennies, build replicas. This is but one example of a Curtiss Jenny that was built just 3 or 4 years ago in South Georgia, was flown successfully a number of times. But as I've said, it's a dangerous, unforgiving airplane. And this is what happened to this particular Curtiss Jenny restoration. It crashed, killed both the pilot and the passenger. Most people that have attempted to restore Curtiss Jennies have wound up like this. So it was known as a dangerous, unforgiving airplane. It's immortalized in a famous post office goof. They printed a sheet or two of stamps with the one plate inserted upside down. The one on the right is a highly sought after collectible worth $100,000 a piece. The one on the left is a 24-cent postage stamp, but the type of airplane was immortalized in the stamp. Bessie arrives in Jacksonville, Florida for the first time on Tuesday, April the 27th of 1926 for a few days of festivities that have been put together by a group known as the Jacksonville Welfare League. Eartha White of the Clara White Mission was the head of the league at the time, and its publicity chairman was a young John Thomas Besh, who went on to become a very well-known businessman here in Jacksonville, but he was Bessie's escort and tour guide during the 4 or 5 days she was expected to be here in Jacksonville. And on the right is a copy of the invitation to a gala dance on the Saturday night following the air show that was to honor Bessie Coleman, but she was slated to speak at local schools and perform an air show on May the 1st, 1926. Gonna digress a little bit and talk about John Besh because he's a fascinating figure in Jacksonville history, not only for what he accomplished, but for the 3 children he produced. His first child, Dr. Janetta Cole, is a well-known educator, was the first African-American woman to serve as the president of Spelman College in Atlanta, a very prestigious, historically Black women's college. She became the first director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American Art. She retired from that position in 2017, and she was on the short list to become Secretary of Education when Bill Clinton was putting together his first cabinet. So that's his first famous offspring. The second is John Besh Jr., who is an internationally famous jazz drummer. He's probably better known in Europe, but he's a superstar in jazz circles. And then his final child, many of you may have heard of the beach lady at American Beach up at Amelia Island, the original environmentalist, if you will, who did so much to Preserve and Protect American Beach, died in 2005, but those are Besh's famous children. Back to Bessie Coleman. She lectures at Jacksonville schools on April 28th and early on April 29th. But one of them is Stanton High School, pictured here just behind the new Duval County Courthouse. But Bessie Coleman spoke there and other places, and I had the privilege of talking to students who were still alive 30 years ago, who remember Bessie's talks and being inspired by what she had to say. And she talked about her life, obstacles she overcame, showed films of her flying, and of course invited everyone to the air show on May the 1st of 1926. Bessie Coleman, I told you earlier, had an influential friend in Chicago named Robert Abbott, the publisher of the Chicago Defender, the man who in all likelihood gave her the money to go to France and obtain her pilot certificate. Ran into him in a Jacksonville restaurant. Abbott had a warning for her. He had heard about this airplane she had purchased. He'd heard about the man who had flown it from Dallas, and he didn't like the sounds of this and urged her not to go flying with him. But she did so anyway. The day before, a William Wills, an experienced pilot from the Dallas area, arrived at Paxson Field, which was where the private flying and what little commercial flying we had was done out of. It was on the site of the current Paxson High School, but that was Jacksonville's original flying field after the Jacksonville beaches. The early aviators used the hard-packed sand of Jacksonville's beaches. But William Wills lands at Paxson Field, and he's met by legendary Jacksonville pilot Laurie Young. And Laurie Young ran the airport. There were a number of pilots who hung out there. One of them was the man who helped induct me into this Rotary Club, Jimmy Howard. Jimmy was born in 1903, retired as the first manager of Jacksonville International Airport, and was a member of Southjax-Rotary until his death in early 2000. Young examined Bessie Coleman's airplane and was shocked and amazed that it had made it all the way from Dallas. He found the engine to be in extremely poor condition, didn't put out much horsepower. This had nothing to do with the accident that would occur, but Young was amazed that Wills and the airplane had made it. Here's a picture of Laurie Young with one of his airplanes that he called the Spirit of Jacksonville. There's a fascinating story of the interaction of this airplane with Charles Lindbergh, but we'll save that for a later date. But here's Laurie Young at Paxson Field. And I was very fortunate 30 years ago, Jimmy Howard took me around one Saturday after we had eaten lunch together and showed me some of these places. And Paxson Field still exists, and this is what it looks like today, almost 100 years later. Bessie Coleman was driven by John Besh to Paxson Field early in the morning of April the 30th. It was a Friday. The purpose of her going to Paxson Field was to see her new airplane and to go for a test flight in it and to scout out an area to do a parachute jump, which was a feature of her air show. So she asks Mr. Wills to fly the airplane so she can sit in the rear cockpit and look around and become familiar with the airport environment. They depart Paxson Field at 7:30 that morning. Wills flew from the front cockpit. Bessie Coleman sat in the rear cockpit. Now, Bessie was very short in stature. In order to see out of that airplane, there was no way she could wear a seatbelt and see over the edge of the fuselage. And so she didn't wear a seatbelt. They take off from Paxson Field from this very pasture. I took this photo about a year ago. They climb to 2,000 feet and begin to circle Paxson Field when something goes horribly wrong. The airplane enters an aerodynamic stall and goes into what is called a spin. A spin is a maneuver or a flight condition that involves the airplane pointing almost nose down with it rotating around the axis of the fuselage. It is a flight maneuver that is taught and practiced, but it is to be avoided in most instances. Unfortunately, we talked about Bessie didn't have a seatbelt on. She was thrown from the airplane and unfortunately fell to her death. The accident occurred right over this intersection of North Edgewood and Broadway. Jimmy Howard showed me where the airplane landed, showed me where Bessie's body landed. She fell to earth in the parking lot of what was a McDonald's restaurant on Edgewood Avenue in this very location here. And the airplane hit the ground with Wills still in the cockpit about 1,000 feet away. John Besh was upset, rushes to the scene of the airplane crash, and the first thing he does is lights a cigarette to calm his nerves. Unfortunately, his cigarette set the spilled gasoline from the airplane on fire, and the airplane wreckage burned, although Wills was certainly dead upon impact, and Bessie died on impact about 1,000 feet away. This is the only photo we have of the wreckage of Bessie's airplane, and I would love to know what happened to this wreckage. It would be a very valuable historical artifact. I guess I'm inspired in part by our member Bill Warner that it's sitting in a garage in Jacksonville somewhere waiting to be restored. But would love that. That would be quite a find to find the wreckage of this. There was no FAA at the time. There was no National Transportation Safety Board. There was no one to investigate airplane crashes. And in fact, this was Jacksonville's first fatal airplane accident, April the 30th of 1926. Famed local aviator Laurie Young came to the scene a short time later and investigated the accident. And what Laurie Young found is that a mechanic's wrench had been left in the tail cone of the airplane and had jammed the elevator circuit here in the tail of the airplane. And so there have been theories over the years that Bessie was murdered. That has never made much sense because Mr. Wills died in the event, and the wrench explains why the airplane went out of control and why control could not be regained. Stray tools continue to be a problem in aviation maintenance to this day. And most maintenance shops, and notably the military, have strict tool control procedures. Here's an example of when you work on an airplane, you use certain tools. You note what tools you use, and the airplane doesn't fly again until they're back in their proper place in the toolbox or checked back into the tool room. But her accident was preventable, but unfortunately all too common and remains a problem or issue in aviation. In the aftermath of Bessie's death, her body was taken to the Lawton Pratt mortuary. This is a recent picture of it. The building still stands on Beaver Street. I think it's still in business. 2 funeral services were held for Bessie here in Jacksonville. The gala planned on the night of the air show the next day was canceled. The air show was canceled, and the African American community that was to celebrate Bessie at the air show instead turned to conducting 2 separate funerals for her. Here in Jacksonville, the first funeral service was held at Bethel Baptist. It was followed a short time later by a funeral service at St. Philip's on Union Street. Her body was then taken to the train station where she had arrived in Triumph just a few days earlier, and taken to Orlando where additional services were held. Her body was then put on the train for Chicago, and her funeral in Chicago is reported to have attracted at least 10,000 mourners. And her grave in Chicago continues to be a shrine for aviators. This is Bessie Coleman's tombstone. And this is a young Ed Booth, probably 25 years ago, making his pilgrimage to Bessie Coleman's grave during a visit to Chicago. The Chicago Defender newspaper put her untimely death on their front page the next day. Gives you a little flavor for the era. The story underneath it's about famed trial attorney Clarence Darrow. It talks about violence in Chicago. We think violence in Chicago is a recent event, but if you look at the top headline of this newspaper, it has been with us for 100 years, but it was front page news in Chicago. Not so in Jacksonville, Florida. If you search the newspapers from the next day, you'll find a brief mention of Bessie Coleman's death on the back page with the supermarket ads. It didn't merit front page, and they publish a picture of Mr. Wills, the pilot, but not Bessie Coleman. And this is really the start of an unfortunate few decades where Bessie Coleman becomes lost to history. But she's been rediscovered in a big way in the past few decades. This is the AP Newswire release that shows up in newspapers around the country, and it tells the story of her death, Mr. Besh, and very little else. I consider myself a historian. I'm proud to be a past president of the Jacksonville Historical Society, and the goal of any historian is to try to bring history to life. And in doing my research for this presentation, I thought, where can I find evidence of Bessie Coleman's time in Jacksonville? And it occurred to me that since she died here, that her death would have been recorded officially here in Jacksonville. You may not know, but the Bureau of Vital Statistics for the entire state of Florida is located in Jacksonville in the Springfield section. And they catalog every birth and death certificate in Florida. And I knew that death certificates were tightly controlled because of identity theft problems, but that if a person had been deceased more than 50 years, their death certificate became a public record. And so I went down to the Bureau of Vital Statistics one day and asked if I could purchase a copy of Bessie Coleman's death certificate. And after a little bit of research, lo and behold, here it is. And it's a fascinating historical record because it brings her to life. It documents what happened. The registrar, the medical examiner signed off on this. Undertaker Lawson Pratt signed the certificate. And then as to the occupation listed for Bessie Coleman, this was a new thing, an aviatrix. Occupation of deceased. Cause of death, accidental falling from airplane. First aircraft fatality in Duval County. Tried to find a death certificate for Mr. Wills, and they have no record of him. We know his brother arrived the next day, took his body back to Texas, but he somehow escaped being officially logged by the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Bessie fades into history at this point. Very few aviation history books written in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s make any mention of her, even though she was the first person of color, person Native American to hold a pilot certificate. She was so lost to history that the first African-American woman to fly on the space shuttle, Dr. Mae Jemison, who happened to be from Chicago, Bessie's hometown, admitted years after her shuttle flight that she was ashamed that she had never heard of Bessie Coleman until after she returned from her space mission, despite having grown up in the same community Bessie called home. There's little to mark her existence here in Jacksonville. Paxson High School, the site of her last takeoff, has a nice plaque. They did an excellent job of this. By the main entrance to the school, but you know, the public would never know it was there. There was talk of naming a conference room at Jax International Airport after her, but we don't have a street named after her and really nothing to mark her accomplishments here in Jacksonville. And I close this presentation by saying it would be fitting and appropriate to have a school named after Bessie Coleman. She spent much of the last years of her life lecturing at schools, including schools here in Jacksonville. And Bessie Coleman High School, Bessie Coleman Middle School would certainly be a fitting tribute to her. And I would implore the Duval County School Board, I don't have any connections with them, maybe you do, to name a school after Bessie Coleman. And I think it needs to be a new school. I think it would be somewhat disingenuous to take the name of a Confederate general off a school and put her name in its place. I think she deserves a brand new school. The rest of the country has recognized her. In 1994, she received her own postage stamp at a time when it was a really big deal to have your own postage stamp. You had to be you know, someone like Elvis to have a postage stamp with your picture on it. But she received a postage stamp. The main entrance road to one of the busiest airports in the world, Chicago O'Hare, is named Bessie Coleman Drive. She is memorialized with schools named after her. This one in her hometown in Texas, Bessie Coleman Middle School. And she has become part of pop culture in recent years, which is a good thing. But what she symbolizes is that when someone tells you you can't do something, you can. And she faced insurmountable obstacles. Had to go to France to learn to fly because no one in the United States would teach her. And her legacy in Jacksonville shouldn't be that she died here. It should be that we honor her with a school to commemorate her life's work and to show that she's firmly entrenched in pop culture. On her 125th birthday in January of 2017, she was honored with the ultimate, a Google Doodle, and a really cool one at that. And so I'm about out of time, and I don't know that we have any time for questions, but it's been fun making this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Skip. That was very well done. Do you have any questions on chat that maybe you can take a look at real quick while we have?
Let me get out of the sharing. Okay. I don't see any questions in chat, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or.
Start as a point of clarification. So, so Skip, are you saying that Patty used to take dancing lessons at a silent film studio? I mean, the years aren't ending up from here.
It was repurposed after the silent film era. It was over, long over, way in the rearview mirror into a dance studio. That's what I was saying.
I'm watching in the back corner there. So,
I'm willing to play piano if she wants to do it.
yeah.
But,
Anybody have any questions for Skip? I think we're good. So, so you know, Skip, usually we make a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Foundation, you know, as thanks to you. But since you're a member of our club, I'm gonna let you do that.
I'm a sustaining Paul Harris person, so I suppose I'm doing that already. So anyway.
All right, very good. Thanks again, Skip.
Well, thanks. I'll see you in person soon.
Great, good. We look forward to it. All right, so so let me just review real quick. So RSVP, if you're going to be with us next week for our holiday luncheon, please, and don't forget to bring a gift for the Daniel kids for the toy drive, and I think that's good. So let's stand and join me in the Rotary motto: service above self, one problem, most serves best. See you next week.